An elderly man in a wheelchair is betrayed and pushed off a building by a ruthless millionaire. But what a horse did that night defied all logic and changed the course of this story forever. The sky, heavy with clouds, covered Seattle, casting shadows over the buildings of the elegant Belltown neighborhood. Anthony Davis observed the landscape through the window of his apartment, his eyes reflecting the storm that was forming both in the sky and within him. The wheelchair, his inseparable companion for 5 years, did not diminish the determination etched on his time-marked face. On the mahogany desk, carefully organized documents and a small device that could change everything. A black flash drive with gold details. Inside it, the truth he had pursued for months, evidence that Charles Anderson, his former partner and once friend, had embezzled millions from the company they had built together over 3 decades. The phone rang, breaking the contemplative silence. Anthony hesitated before answering. "Anthony, we need to talk." Charles's deep and controlled voice was unmistakable. "Tonight, at my penthouse. Just the two of us like old times. After everything I've discovered, you still expect me to come to you as if nothing happened?" Anthony replied, holding the phone firmly. "Precisely because of that. Perhaps there's still a solution that benefits us both. Unless you prefer this situation to take proportions neither of us wants." The veiled threat didn't go unnoticed. After a moment of reflection, Anthony agreed. "I'll be there at 8. As he prepared for the meeting, memories flooded his mind. The early years of their partnership, building the Davis-Anderson Developments empire. Families gathered at year-end dinners. The accident that put him in a wheelchair and Charles's gradual change in behavior, taking complete control while he recovered. And finally, the discoveries of recent months. Falsified documents, suspicious transactions, offshore accounts. Before leaving, Anthony went to the desk to get the flash drive, but froze. The device wasn't where he had left it. He searched, frantically scouring every inch until the inevitable conclusion: someone had entered his apartment. His heart raced. The building's security was impeccable, which meant the intruder had privileged access or inside help. On the other side of the city, at the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, where people with different types of disabilities underwent animal-assisted therapies, a horse named Apollo was showing unusual behavior. The majestic chestnut animal with imposing bearing, normally docile and receptive, whinnied restlessly, circling in the stable as if sensing something. "What's wrong with him today?" asked Melissa Rivers, the veterinarian in charge, watching the animal with concern. "I've never seen him like this," replied Ted, the most experienced handler. "It's as if he's trying to tell us something." Melissa approached carefully, stroking the horse's neck. "Easy, Apollo, what are you feeling?" The animal seemed to fix its gaze on a distant point, in the northern direction of the city, exactly where Belltown was located. Meanwhile, Charles Anderson contemplated the panoramic view of Seattle from the comfort of his luxurious penthouse. A glass of whiskey in his hands and a contained smile on his lips, his assistant, Ryan, entered discreetly. "Sir, everything is prepared as requested, and regarding the object you mentioned." Charles swirled the glass, watching the amber liquid. "It has been recovered. Our friend will have nothing to use against me." The assistant nodded and left silently, leaving Charles alone with his thoughts. The businessman stood up and approached the balcony, looking at the 20 floors that separated him from the ground. "Tonight, my dear Anthony, our long partnership will have a definitive conclusion," he murmured to himself, as the first drops of rain began to fall on the city. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give a like. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We continue. The absence of the flash drive left Anthony on high alert. Even so, he decided to proceed with the plan and meet Charles. Perhaps he could extract some confession, any information he could use later. There was no time to retreat. The driver was already waiting in the building lobby. During the journey, the rain intensified, pounding the car window with fury. The driver cast concerned glances through the rearview mirror. "Mr. Davis, are you sure you want to continue? This storm is only going to get worse. Keep driving, Richard. Some matters can't wait, not even for good weather." Richard nodded, respecting his employer's determination. He had known Anthony for more than 2 decades and knew how to recognize that resolute expression. When they arrived at the elegant Montclair building where Charles resided, Richard helped Anthony with the wheelchair. "Should I wait for you, sir?" "Yes, but not down here. Go have a coffee at the mall next door. I don't know how long I'll..." Finished at the rehabilitation center, Melissa had decided to stay. Beyond her hours to monitor Apollo, the animal's behavior intrigued her deeply. "I've never seen anything like this," she commented to Claire, another veterinarian who had agreed to stay and help. "It's as if he's connected to something we can't perceive." Claire, who had been studying animal behavior for years, approached the horse. "I've read about similar cases. Some animals develop inexplicable connections with specific humans. Apollo has always been special with our patients, especially with those in wheelchairs," Melissa reflected. "Remember how he reacted when Anthony Davis came to make that donation last month? It was the only time I've seen him interact with someone outside the therapy program." The name Anthony seemed to awaken something in Apollo, who whinnied louder and intensified his restlessness. In the penthouse of the Montclair building, Charles waited with apparent tranquility. Impeccably dressed in a dark grey suit, he walked around the spacious living room with the confidence of someone who has the world under control. The doorbell rang, and his assistant, Ryan, opened the door. Anthony entered, maneuvering his wheelchair skillfully through the space. His eyes, astute and experienced, quickly scanned the environment, looking for signs of danger, or perhaps his lost flash drive. "Welcome, old friend," Charles approached, offering a handshake that Anthony refused, with a subtle gesture. "I'm not here for formalities, Charles. You know why I came." Charles smiled, pouring himself more whiskey. "Would you like a drink?" "I want answers. What did you do with the company's money?" "With my money? Why did you forge my signature on the transfer contracts?" "Straight to the point as always," Charles sighed, signaling to Ryan that he could leave. When they were alone, his expression hardened. "Do you really believe you can threaten me with these unfounded accusations?" "They're not accusations, they're facts. I have evidence." "Had," Charles corrected, removing from his pocket the flash drive that had disappeared from Anthony's apartment. "Is this what you're looking for? My resources are more extensive than you imagine." Anthony felt a chill down his spine but maintained his composure. "That device is just a copy. Do you really think I would keep the only evidence in such an obvious place?" Uncertainty briefly crossed Charles's face. "You're bluffing." "Test me," challenged Anthony. "Tomorrow all the documents will reach the proper authorities and the press, unless..." "Unless what?" Charles asked, approaching dangerously. "Unless you confess everything, return the money and completely distance yourself from the company. We can craft a narrative that minimizes damage to your reputation." Charles laughed, the sound echoing through the spacious apartment. "You really don't understand, do you? There is no more our company. There is only my company. As for you..." He leaned in, whispering as if sharing a secret. "You know what the press will say when they find your body. That poor Anthony Davis, unable to accept his new condition, his irrelevance in business, decided to end his own suffering." The explicit threat made Anthony realize the gravity of the situation. It wasn't a meeting for negotiations. Charles wasn't there to talk, but to definitively eliminate the problem. At that moment, Anthony's cell phone vibrated. On the screen, a message he barely had time to read. Detective Stanley confirmed receipt of the documents. Operation scheduled for early tomorrow. Charles noticed the change in Anthony's expression. "Bad news." "On the contrary," replied Anthony, regaining confidence. "It seems your time has run out sooner than you thought." The tension between the two businessmen reached its peak. The message on Anthony's cell phone had unexpectedly turned the game around. Charles, realizing that his plan was beginning to crumble, moved quickly around the luxurious room, trying to regain control of the situation. "What message is that, Anthony?" "From whom?" he demanded, his face contorted into a mask of contained fury. "Let's just say I've taken some precautions," replied Anthony, maneuvering his wheelchair to maintain distance. "Trusted people already have copies of everything. Documents, bank transfers, recordings of your meetings with clients to whom you promised participation in dubious schemes." Charles was silent for a moment, calculating his options. His eyes scanned the apartment until they fixed on the open balcony, where the storm was gradually intensifying. A plan formed in his mind. Impressive, I must admit. You've always been meticulous. His tone softened, almost nostalgic. Remember when we started? 2 small offices downtown, dreaming of the skyscrapers we would build. Anthony didn't lower his guard. He knew that tactic well. Charles always resorted to sentimentality. When he was cornered, don't try to manipulate the situation. It's over. Charles, maybe you're right. Maybe it's time to start over. Charles approached the balcony, gesturing for Anthony to follow. Come see the city we helped build. One last time as friends. Reluctantly but intrigued, Anthony moved his chair toward the balcony. The rain had given a momentary truce, although the wind still blew with intensity. At the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, Apollo was becoming increasingly agitated. The horse reared several times, surprising Melissa and Claire, who had never witnessed such behavior. We need to sedate him, suggested Claire, concerned. He might hurt himself. No, replied Melissa, watching attentively. There's something else happening here. Ted, the handler, came running into the stable. I just saw the news. You know that businessman, Anthony Davis, who made the donation to the center last month? They say he's facing a corporate scandal, something about fund misappropriation and his ex-partner. Melissa instantly connected the dots. It was to Mr. Davis that Apollo showed that unusual reaction when he visited the center. In Charles's apartment, the conversation continued on the balcony. The panoramic view of Seattle stretched before them, lights twinkling like earthly stars under the cloudy sky. You're vain, Charles. You always have been. You think you can cover everything up, but not this time, provoked Anthony, feeling he needed to keep his ex-partner talking while buying time. Charles leaned on the railing of the balcony, his knuckles white from the pressure. You know what your problem is, Anthony? You never knew when to stop. Before the accident, it was you who pushed for aggressive expansions, risky acquisitions. And now, when we're finally reaping the fruits, you want to throw everything away because, so see what, sudden morality. Because of theft, Charles, you betrayed me, betrayed our friendship, our partnership. Thunder tore through the sky, briefly illuminating Charles's face with a spectral clarity. In that instant, he made his decision. You left me no choice, he murmured almost to himself. With a quick and calculated movement, Charles pushed the wheelchair forcefully toward the edge of the balcony. Anthony, caught by surprise, tried to brake, but the chair gained momentum on the wet marble floor. Time seemed to slow down. Anthony felt the exact moment when the wheels crossed the limit of the balcony. His chair tilted dangerously forward, and he glimpsed the abyss that opened below, 20 floors of free fall. At the rehabilitation center, Apollo emitted a deafening whinny and, in an impulse of extraordinary strength, broke the lock on the stable gate. Melissa and Claire watched astonished as the animal dashed out of the center, ignoring the desperate calls of the team. Where is he going? Shouted Claire. I don't know, replied Melissa, but something tells me we shouldn't stop him. Ted ran to his car. I'll follow him. Meanwhile, at the last instant before the definitive fall, Anthony managed to grab the balcony railing with one hand, his body partially suspended in the air. The wheelchair plummeted, disappearing into the darkness of the night. Charles, he shouted, his voice mixing with the howl of the wind. Help me! Charles slowly approached, watching Anthony struggle to stay safe. His eyes, previously burning with anger, now displayed a calculating coldness. You know what's fascinating about an accident, Anthony? No one questions much, especially when the victim already showed evident fragilities. Don't do this, pleaded Anthony, feeling his fingers gradually slip. Think about everything we built together. For a brief moment, something akin to hesitation crossed Charles's face. Shared memories, triumphs, and difficulties overcome together. Flashes of a friendship that once seemed indestructible. Then, the mask of coldness returned. Goodbye, old friend. And with those words, Charles stepped on Anthony's hand, breaking his last link to safety. The fall seemed endless. The wind cut Anthony's face while the city dissolved into luminous blurs around him. There was a strange calm in his mind, as if the final seconds expanded to allow a last contemplation of the life he had lived. Images of his family, professional achievements, and Charles's traitorous smile mixed in a chaotic sequence. He closed, his eyes preparing for the inevitable impact. But fate had other plans. Apollo galloped through the streets of Seattle as if he possessed a precise mental map. Drivers braked abruptly, pedestrians jumped aside, while the majestic animal continued. Determinedly, ignoring traffic lights and intersections, Ted followed with difficulty, trying not to lose sight of the horse while driving his car. "Downtown Green Lake, now Belltown," he murmured to himself, noticing the pattern of the route. "He's heading to Belltown." At the exact moment when Anthony was about to hit the ground, Apollo appeared like a mystical apparition, strategically positioning himself under the trajectory of the fall. The impact was violent, but the muscular body of the horse absorbed much of the shock. Both fell to the ground, Anthony unconscious on the back of the animal. The atypical noise attracted the attention of the few passers-by who were braving the rain. Soon a small group formed around the incredible scene. Among them, a young doctor returning from her shift. "I'm a doctor. Let me through," announced Laura Mendez, rushing to check Anthony's condition. "Someone call an ambulance now." While examining Anthony's vital signs, Laura could hardly believe what she was seeing. How is this possible? A fall from this height should have been fatal. Ted finally reached the location, getting out of the car breathless. "The horse. He's from the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center. He escaped today. Seemed to know exactly where he was going." In the penthouse, Charles observed the movement below with an expression of disbelief. His cell phone rang. It was Ryan, his assistant. "Sir, something extraordinary happened. Mr. Davis. He survived the fall. A horse appeared out of nowhere. And it's difficult to explain. People are filming. It's already on social media." Charles felt the blood freeze in his veins. Impossible. "And there's more, sir. I'm receiving information that Detective Stanley is mobilizing a team. It seems someone sent compromising documents to the police station earlier today." The news hit Charles like a physical blow. His meticulous plan was crumbling in a spectacular and unexpected manner. He needed to act quickly. "Ryan, prepare the jet. We need to leave the country immediately." "Sir, with all due respect, I think that would only worsen the situation. The borders will be monitored in a matter of hours." Charles hung up the phone, his mind frantically searching for a way out. At Holy Cross Hospital, where Anthony was taken, the medical team worked intensively to stabilize him. Miraculously, his injuries were less severe than expected. Some fractures, severe contusions, but nothing that immediately threatened his life. Meanwhile, Melissa arrived at the hospital, having been informed by Ted about what had happened. "How is Apollo?" she asked immediately. "Injured but alive. Veterinarians are already taking care of him. The incredible thing is that he refuses to leave the vicinity of the hospital. He's in the parking lot, as if standing guard." The news of the businessman who survived a 20-floor fall thanks to a telepathic horse spread rapidly. In less than an hour, journalists crowded the hospital entrance, broadcasting the development of the case live. A reporter related enthusiastically, "We are witnessing one of the most extraordinary events ever recorded in Seattle. Businessman Anthony Davis survived a fall that would certainly have been fatal thanks to the almost supernatural intervention of a horse from the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, specialized in therapies for people with disabilities." The continuous coverage began to arouse national interest, especially when rumors emerged that the fall might not have been accidental. Detective Stanley, arriving at the hospital, was immediately surrounded by reporters. "Detective, is there a possibility of attempted homicide?" Stanley, a middle-aged man with a severe expression and impeccable posture, responded cautiously, "We are investigating all possibilities. We have received relevant information that is being verified. For now, our focus is ensuring Mr. Davis's safety." In the hospital room, Anthony finally regained consciousness. Confused and disoriented, he tried to understand where he was and what had happened. "The horse," he murmured with difficulty. "Where is the horse?" The nurse smiled, adjusting his IV. "He's outside, Mr. Davis. Won't leave the parking lot. I've never seen anything like it." Anthony closed his eyes, tears silently streaming. "He saved me." "Yes, sir. And he saved more than your life. The evidence you sent to Detective Stanley was received. Mr. Anderson is being sought at this moment." Slight smile formed on Anthony's lips. Against all odds, his truth would finally be revealed. The news of the horse miracle, as the newspapers began to call the incident, quickly dominated national news. Images of Apollo beside the hospital circulated on social media, provoking a wave of emotion. Animal behavior specialists were invited to television programs in an attempt to explain the inexplicable phenomenon. Charles watched everything with increasing desperation from the hotel room where he had hidden. After fleeing his penthouse, he checked in under a false name at a discreet establishment on the outskirts of Seattle. Ryan was his only contact with the outside world. "The situation is worsening by the hour, sir," the assistant informed him. "By phone. The security cameras from your building have been seized, and there's more. One of the security guards claims to have seen the exact moment when when Mr. Davis fell." Charles felt his stomach sink. "Who?" "Frank Michaels, the night shift guard. He was checking the monitoring system and saw everything through the external camera." "Find him," ordered Charles, his voice trembling with urgency. "Offer whatever necessary for his silence." "I've already tried, sir. He's cooperating with the police. It seems he has a son with cerebral palsy who receives treatment precisely at the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center. The coincidence deeply affected him." Charles hung up the phone violently, throwing it against the wall. The coincidences were accumulating against him, weaving a net from which escape seemed impossible. At the hospital, Anthony received a visit from Detective Stanley. Despite his injuries, his mind was clear and determined. "The documents I received are quite convincing, Mr. Davis," commented the detective, leafing through a folder. "Transfers, falsified contracts, records of accounts in tax havens. But we need your formal statement." "I'm ready," replied Anthony, adjusting himself in the hospital bed. "But first, I want to know about Apollo, the horse." Stanley smiled slightly. "He's being well cared for. The veterinarians, Melissa Rivers, I believe, is personally taking care of him. Impressive creature. You know, my wife always says there are more mysteries between heaven and earth than our vain philosophy can comprehend." "Shakespeare," identified Anthony. "And she's right." The conversation was interrupted by the entrance of a middle-aged woman with elegant posture and penetrating gaze. Helen. Anthony was surprised. Helen Anderson, Charles's wife, approached the bed with measured steps. "I came as soon as I heard, Anthony. I needed to see with my own eyes that you're alive." The detective, sensing the tension, offered to leave, but Anthony asked him to stay. "Helen knows everything, Detective. In fact, she was the one who initially alerted me about Charles's suspicious activities." This revelation clearly surprised Stanley. "You reported your own husband, ma'am?" Helen sat on the edge of Anthony's bed, holding his hand with evident affection. "Charles changed, Detective. He's no longer the man I married. Ambition completely consumed him. When I discovered the embezzlements, I tried to confront him, but he threatened to take my daughter from me." "We'll need your statement as well, Mrs. Anderson," said Stanley, taking notes in his notebook. "It could be crucial for the case." "I'll be available," replied Helen, turning to Anthony. "You could have died. I would never have forgiven myself." "It wasn't your fault," Anthony consoled her. "At the rehabilitation center, a team of journalists was interviewing Melissa about Apollo. He has always demonstrated extraordinary sensitivity with our patients, especially with those in wheelchairs," explained the veterinarian. "But never in all my years of profession have I witnessed behavior like this. It's as if Apollo and Mr. Davis had developed a connection beyond our understanding." "Do you believe the horse sensed that the businessman was in danger?" asked a reporter, microphone in hand. "Science can't fully explain what happened," replied Melissa cautiously, "but we know that some animals possess senses much more acute than ours and can perceive energetic alterations that escape us. Meanwhile, Ted, who had remained at the hospital monitoring Apollo, noticed a suspicious man photographing the horse and the hospital entrances. His instinct alerted him. Something wasn't right. "Excuse me," he approached the man. "Are you from the press?" The stranger quickly put away the camera. "Just a curious onlooker," he replied dryly before moving away with hasty steps. Ted immediately called Detective Stanley. "I think someone was monitoring the hospital, sir, and he didn't seem to be a journalist." Charles received constant updates on the developments through Ryan, who was still loyal to him. The discovery that Helen was collaborating with the authorities was the final blow to his already shaken equilibrium. "My own wife," he murmured in disbelief. "After everything I built for us." "The net is closing, sir," warned Ryan. "Perhaps it's time to consider negotiating with justice. A good lawyer could—" "Negotiate," interrupted Charles, his voice laden with indignation. "Everything I did was to expand our business. Anthony never had the courage necessary for big plays. If it weren't for me, the company would be stagnant." 3 days passed since the incident that the press now called the Miracle of Apollo. The case had gained national proportions, with special reports exploring both the inexplicable rescue and the corporate scandal that was coming to light. At the hospital, Anthony showed significant improvements. Sitting on the bed, he was watching television when Helen entered the room bringing fresh flowers. "The doctors say you can be discharged soon," she commented, arranging the flowers in a vase. "It's incredible how quickly you've recovered." "I have good reasons to get back to action soon," replied Anthony, turning off the television. "There's a lot of work ahead to rebuild everything Charles destroyed." Helen hesitated, sitting in the armchair next to the bed. "I need to tell you something, Anthony. Something I only discovered recently." The seriousness in her tone alerted Anthony. "What happened?" "I found records of transactions prior to your accident. Charles was already diverting money much earlier than we thought, even before you became incapacitated." Anthony processed the information slowly. "That would explain some discrepancies I noticed at the time, but ended up ignoring because I trusted him. There's more," continued Helen, her voice almost a whisper. "I have reason to believe that your accident may not have been accidental. The revelation fell like a bomb. 5 years earlier, Anthony had suffered a serious car accident that left him paraplegic. The investigation concluded that there had been a mechanical failure in the brakes, classifying the incident as a fatality." "Are you suggesting that Charles sabotaged my car?" he asked, his voice trembling with contained emotion. "I found an exchange of emails between him and an unknown mechanic, dated 3 days before the accident. I handed everything to Detective Stanley this morning." At the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, the routine had been completely altered. Dozens of journalists camped nearby, waiting for statements or ideally an appearance of Apollo, who had returned to the center after receiving veterinary treatment. Melissa was conducting an emergency meeting with her team. "The media attention is a unique opportunity to promote the work we do here," she explained. "But we need to protect our patients and animals from excessive harassment." Claire raised her hand. "I received a call from Mr. Davis's personal assistant. He expressed interest in expanding the equine therapy program and making a substantial donation." The news was received with enthusiasm by the team. Melissa, however, maintained a concerned expression. "There's something else you should know," she said, after a moment of hesitation. "I received a disturbing visit last night. A man offered a considerable amount for Apollo to suffer an accident." There were exclamations of indignation among those present. Ted, who had become especially protective of the horse, clenched his fists in anger. "Did you report it to the police?" "Immediately. Detective Stanley sent a patrol car to monitor the center 24 hours a day. But we need to redouble our vigilance." At the police station, Stanley meticulously built his case. The walls of his office were covered with photos, documents, and diagrams connected by colored lines, the visual map of a conspiracy that was revealing itself to be deeper each day. "The circle is closing," he commented to his assistant, Inspector Deborah Reed. The new evidence brought by Mrs. Anderson suggests long-term premeditation. And what about the accident from 5 years ago? We're reopening the investigation. If we prove sabotage, we'll add attempted homicide to the charges. The inspector carefully examined the photographs of Anthony's destroyed car. What intrigues me is the connection with the horse. Of all the animals at that center, why specifically did Apollo develop this link with Davis? Stanley smiled slightly. Perhaps we should ask them. In his hideout, Charles realized that his options were rapidly diminishing. Ryan had contacted him to inform that police had visited all his known properties and frozen his bank accounts in the country. I still have access to offshore funds, he reflected, mentally counting his resources. I can start over somewhere else. His cell phone vibrated with an anonymous message. Documents ready. Forks Airport, tomorrow. 5 a.m. last chance. Charles responded immediately. I'll be there. At the hospital, Anthony received an unexpected visit. Julia, his 28-year-old daughter, who had been living in London for almost a decade. Dad, she said, carefully hugging him, I came as soon as I heard. Why didn't you tell me what was happening? I didn't want to worry you, dear. Your career is taking off. You have your own life to manage. Julia shook her head, clearly dissatisfied with the response. Helen told me everything. About the embezzlements, about the suspicion regarding your accident, about the attempt. What happened on the penthouse balcony? Anthony held his daughter's hand. There's something I need to ask you. Something I've been avoiding for years. Why did you really distance yourself after my accident? The question caught Julia by surprise. Her eyes filled with tears. Charles told me that you asked of a distance, that seeing your only daughter would constantly remind you of what you had lost, of the active life you could no longer have. And you believed that? Asked Anthony, the pain evident in his voice. He showed me emails, Dad. Emails? From you asking me to live my life away from the whole situation. He said you needed to adapt to the new reality on your own. Anthony closed his eyes, the magnitude of Charles's betrayal finally revealing itself completely. He had not only stolen his company and tried to take his life, he had stolen years of companionship with his only daughter. I never sent those emails, Julia. I never stopped wanting you around. They were the 5 loneliest years of my life, Father. And daughter embraced, silent tears sealing the beginning of a long-needed reconciliation. At that moment, a nurse entered the room. Mr. Davis, there's someone special here to see you. To Anthony and Julia's surprise, a familiar whinny echoed through the corridor. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And give a like. Tell us what city you're watching us from. We continue. This isn't regulation, said the nurse with a complicit smile, as Melissa led Apollo through the hospital corridor. The impact of the horse's presence in the hospital environment was visible in the astonished faces of patients, visitors, and staff. Some took photos, others pointed, murmuring in a tone of reverence. We got special authorization from the board, explained Melissa. After your story went viral, they agreed that this visit could be beneficial for Mr. Davis's recovery. When Apollo entered the room, Anthony felt a lump in his throat. The majestic animal approached carefully, as if understanding the fragility of the moment. He inclined his head, gently touching Anthony's arm with his muzzle. Hello, friend, whispered Anthony, caressing the horse's mane. You saved me. Julia watched the scene in wonder. It's incredible. It seems like you've known each other for years. Melissa smiled. Some believe there are connections that transcend our rational understanding. In my years working with therapeutic animals, I've witnessed extraordinary moments, but nothing like the bond between Apollo and your father. How is he? Asked Anthony, noticing some bandages on the animal's body. Physically, he's recovering. Well, from the injuries caused by the impact, replied Melissa. Emotionally, well, he has been restless. This is the first time I've seen him truly calm since the incident. The visit, although brief due to hospital restrictions, visibly renewed Anthony's spirits. After Apollo's departure, he seemed energized, with that characteristic determination that had built his business empire shining again in his eyes. Julia, I need your help, he said, as soon as they were alone. "Charles will try to escape. I'm sure of it. I know him too well to believe he'll face the consequences of his actions." "Isn't Detective Stanley monitoring the borders?" "Yes, but Charles has resources. He always maintained contingency plans for extreme situations." Julia took out her laptop. "During my master's in financial information technology, I developed algorithms to track suspicious transactions in real time. If he's moving money to facilitate an escape, I can find patterns." Meanwhile, in the suburban hotel, Charles prepared for his departure. He had dyed his hair, adopted a simpler appearance, and gathered only the essentials in a discreet backpack. The plan was simple: leave Seattle by bus to Port Angeles, where false documents and a small private plane awaited him to cross into Canada. His phone rang. Helen. He hesitated before answering. His wife had betrayed him, collaborating with Anthony and the authorities, but she was still his main connection to the outside world. "Charles, I know you're planning to flee," Helen said without preamble. "I'm beginning to think you never really knew me," he replied bitterly. "How could you turn against me after everything we built?" "Everything we built," Helen repeated, indignant. "You diverted millions, possibly caused the accident that left Anthony paraplegic, separated father and daughter with lies, and tried to eliminate him definitively. What kind of building is that? You don't understand. Anthony was weak, always avoiding bigger risks. Our company only grew when I took total control." "At the cost of betrayals, lies, and violence," Helen retorted. "Turn yourself in, Charles. There's still a chance to minimize the damage. Think of our daughter." The mention of their daughter hit Charles like a physical punch. Clarissa, 19 years old, an architecture student in Boston, still didn't know anything. The scandal would soon reach her, tarnishing her name and future. "It's too late," he murmured, hanging up. At the hospital, Julia worked intensely on her laptop, tracking suspicious financial movements. "I found something," she finally announced. Large amounts being transferred through layers of shell companies, culminating in a payment to an air taxi company in Port Angeles. The transaction was made less than an hour ago. Anthony immediately picked up the phone, dialing Detective Stanley. At the police station, Stanley and his team mobilized quickly upon receiving the information. "All units, attention," he communicated over the radio. "Suspect Charles Anderson will possibly attempt escape via Port Angeles. Establish barriers at the main exits of Seattle and especially monitor bus terminals." Inspector Deborah Reed analyzed the logistics. "He'll probably avoid commercial airports due to facial recognition. The land route to Port Angeles takes approximately 3 hours in normal conditions." "Make it 2 hours if he has a driver willing to take risks," corrected Stanley. "Let's request support from the State Patrol, and we need judicial authorization to access all toll cameras." "And what about the Port Angeles airport?" "Contact the Border Patrol. I want agents at each hangar, especially the private ones." The encirclement was progressively tightening. While the authorities mobilized, Helen made her own move. Knowing her husband's habits deeply, she headed to a small hotel on the outskirts of Seattle, a discreet establishment that Charles had previously used for extramarital encounters she had always pretended not to know about. "I need to speak with the guest in room 27, she told the receptionist. "I'm sorry, ma'am, we don't have any guest in that room currently." Helen showed a photo of Charles with his new look. "This man, he's staying here." The receptionist hesitated. "I can't disclose information about our guests." "I'm Helen Anderson, his wife. It's an urgent family matter." Reluctantly, the receptionist confirmed with a brief nod. "Room 14, but he left about 20 minutes ago. He took a taxi at the corner." Helen immediately called Detective Stanley, updating him on the situation. At the hospital, Anthony was receiving a visit from his lawyer, discussing the next legal steps to regain control of the company. Julia remained by his side, constantly, monitoring her laptop for new financial movements that might indicate Charles's steps. "Dad," she called suddenly, "a reservation just appeared in the name of Ryan Mendel at a lodge in Olympia. He's Charles's assistant, isn't he?" "Yes," confirmed Anthony. "Olympia is on the way to Port Angeles. He must be making a strategic stop, probably waiting for police movement to decrease." The lawyer, impressed with Julia's efficiency, asked, How can you access this information so quickly? Julia smiled discreetly. Let's just say some digital barriers are particularly porous when you know where to look. At the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, Melissa was conducting a small group of journalists on a controlled visit, taking advantage of the media attention to publicize the importance of equine therapy. As they passed Apollo's stable, the horse, which had been calm until then, began to show the same agitation as in previous days. "It's happening again," murmured Claire, approaching with concern. Melissa politely dismissed the journalists and focused on the animal. Apollo whinnied, stomping his hooves impatiently. There was an urgency in his behavior that couldn't be ignored. "Someone needs to alert Mr. Davis," said Melissa. "Something is about to happen." Highway I-5, the main corridor between Seattle and Port Angeles, was bustling with intense movement that afternoon. Among the various vehicles traveling its asphalt, a discreet silver Corolla stood out only by its speed above the limit. Charles drove with concentration, constantly checking the rearview mirror. The 2 hours since his departure from Seattle had been exhausting, with enough adrenaline to keep him alert despite the lack of sleep in recent days. The plan had changed. Ryan had been just a decoy, making the reservation in Olympia to divert attention while he headed directly to Port Angeles. His cell phone, now with an untraceable prepaid number, rang. It was his contact in Canada. "Where are you?" asked the voice on the other end. "Leaving Tacoma," replied Charles, checking the highway sign. "I'll arrive in approximately 4 hours. There's unusual movement at the border. Border Patrol is conducting thorough checks." The news about reinforced border inspection was concerning, but not unexpected. "Maintain the original plan. We'll meet at the agreed point." At the Seattle police station, Detective Stanley coordinated a crisis room. Large screens displayed maps of the region with red dots indicating police barriers and monitoring cameras. "The reservation in Olympia is obviously a distraction," he concluded. "Anderson is too methodical to leave such evident traces." Inspector Deborah nodded, analyzing recently arrived reports. "We just received images from a toll camera near Tacoma. Vehicle with compatible characteristics was flagged approximately 40 minutes ago." "Send the images for facial recognition," ordered Stanley, "and alert all units on the route. I want mobile teams ready for interception." At the hospital, Anthony received concerning news from the rehabilitation center. "Melissa called," informed Julia. "Apollo is extremely agitated again. She believes it might be similar to the behavior he showed before the incident." Anthony thought for a moment. "We need to get medical discharge immediately. I feel I should be at the center." "But Dad, you're still recovering," protested Julia. "Trust me, daughter. There's a connection I can't explain, but I can feel if Apollo is agitated, there's a reason." While Anthony arranged for his hospital discharge against medical recommendations, Helen arrived at the police station, offering to assist in the investigations. "I know Charles better than anyone," she explained to the detective. "I know how he thinks, what alternative routes he might consider." Stanley, initially hesitant, recognized the strategic value of that knowledge. "Mrs. Anderson, any information could be crucial at this moment." Helen examined the map spread on the table. "Charles always considered I-5 too monitored. There's an alternative route he used for discrete trips, secondary roads passing through Enumclaw and Aberdeen. It takes longer, but has much less surveillance." The information prompted an immediate reorientation of operations. Teams were redirected to cover the mentioned secondary routes. On the highway, Charles decided to stop at an isolated gas station to refuel and briefly rest. While paying for the fuel, he noticed a television showing local news. To his horror, he saw his own face on the screen. A recent photo, not the one officially circulating on networks. The report mentioned national search and alert at all borders. "Everything all right, sir?" asked the attendant, noticing his sudden paleness. "Yes," Charles responded, forcing a smile. "Just tired from the road." He quickly returned to the cigar, his mind calculating alternatives. Someone close had leaked his current appearance. Helen? Ryan? The options were diminishing. At the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, Anthony's arrival caused a commotion. Supported by provisional crutches and accompanied by Julia, he was received by Melissa and her team. "You should be in the hospital," the veterinarian reprimanded, visibly concerned. "I need to see Apollo," insisted Anthony. "Where is he?" Melissa led them to the stable, where the horse continued to show increasing restlessness. Upon seeing Anthony, however, Apollo momentarily calmed, approaching the gate. "Hello, friend," greeted Anthony, touching the animal's muzzle. "I'm here now." The moment of tranquility was brief. In seconds, Apollo returned to showing agitation, whinnying and moving in circles. "What's happening with him?" asked Julia, perplexed. Melissa watched attentively. "He seems to be trying to communicate something specific. See how he repeatedly looks in the same direction." Anthony followed the animal's gaze, which consistently pointed westward, the general direction of Port Angeles. His cell phone rang. It was Detective Stanley. "Mr. Davis, we have news. Charles was identified at a gas station near Aberdeen. We're mobilizing teams for interception." "On which highway exactly?" asked Anthony, a suspicion forming in his mind. "A secondary road, Highway 12. Helen suggested he might use alternative routes to avoid surveillance." Anthony exchanged a significant look with Melissa, who observed Apollo pointing precisely in the direction mentioned by the detective. "You won't believe this," he murmured, showing the phone so Julia and Melissa could hear. "The direction Apollo is indicating." The coincidence was too impressive to be ignored. Melissa, a scientist by training, but open to inexplicable possibilities, felt a shiver run down her spine. "I've heard stories about animals with extraordinary sensitivities," she commented, "but this surpasses any documented precedent. In her almost 30 years of experience with horses, she had never witnessed such a deep connection between human and animal." On the secondary road, Charles noticed police lights approaching rapidly. The police had located his vehicle faster than he had thought possible. In an impulsive decision, he abandoned the planned route, diverting to an unpaved rural path he had known years before during a real estate project in the region. At the rehabilitation center, Anthony followed updates of the pursuit by phone. Each change of direction made by Charles seemed to be anticipated by Apollo, who adjusted his indicative posture as the pursuit evolved. "It's as if he's seeing everything in real time," commented Julia, fascinated and frightened at the same time. Detective Stanley, hearing the reports about the horse's behavior, initially skeptical, began to reconsider. "Mr. Davis, Charles has just diverted to a rural road. Our teams are having difficulty following him on the rough terrain." "Wait," interrupted Anthony, watching Apollo attentively. "The horse is trying to show something different now. Melissa, what is he doing?" The veterinarian observed the animal with professional attention. "He's simulating a blocking movement, as if he wants to prevent passage." "Detective," Anthony returned to the phone, "is there a bridge or narrow passage on that rural road?" There was a moment of silence as Stanley consulted the map. "Yes, there's a bridge over the Quinault River, a few kilometers ahead. It's the only crossing within a 20-kilometer radius." "Concentrate your teams there," suggested Anthony. "If they can block the bridge, Charles will have no way out." The suggestion was immediately accepted. Police teams were redirected to surround the bridge area, establishing a strategic blockade that would prove decisive. Charles, confident that he had eluded his pursuers, drove rapidly down the dusty road, approaching the bridge that represented his only viable escape route. Upon seeing the lights of police vehicles positioned on the other side, he finally realized that his options had run out. The bridge over the Quinault River, a modest concrete structure that barely accommodated two vehicles side by side, became the stage for the final confrontation. Charles braked abruptly upon seeing the police blockade. His calculating mind, always so efficient at finding exits from difficult situations, now spun frantically in search of alternatives. "Attention, Charles Anderson!" The voice, amplified by the megaphone, echoed in the quiet of the late afternoon. "This is Detective Stanley. You are surrounded. Turn off the engine and exit the vehicle with your hands where we can see them." Charles quickly assessed the scenario. Before him, the bridge blocked by 3 police cars. Behind, the dust from the rural road had not yet settled, but the sound of approaching sirens indicated that more police were arriving to close the trap. The riverbanks, steep and rocky, made any escape on foot impossible. In the passenger seat, the backpack with false documents, money, and a satellite phone represented his last hope for a new life away from here. Everything meticulously planned, now reduced to nothing. "It's over," he murmured to himself, a bitter realization he never imagined having to make. Slowly, he turned off the engine. His hands, always steady in million-dollar negotiations, now trembled slightly. Before getting out, he checked his cell phone one last time, finding an unread message from Helen. "Clarissa knows everything. She wants to talk to you before it's too late." The mention of his daughter triggered a wave of contradictory emotions: regret, shame, longing. In all his calculations, Charles had never foreseen the weight he would feel in disappointing the only person whose judgment really mattered to him. At the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, Anthony, Julia, Melissa, and the entire team followed. The developments through the police radio that the detective had purposely left open. Apollo, previously agitated, now showed surprising calmness, as if he knew that his inexplicable mission had been accomplished. "It's unbelievable," commented Julia, still processing the extraordinary events of those days. "How could a horse—" "No, there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in your philosophy," quoted Melissa, smiling. Shakespeare was right. "Detective," called Anthony over the phone after hearing that Charles had finally surrendered. "May I make a request?" "Of course, Mr. Davis." "When you bring him back to Seattle, I'd like to see him." The request surprised everyone who heard it. Julia looked at her father with a confused expression. "Are you sure?" asked Stanley, equally surprised. "Absolutely. There are matters that need to be closed personally." At the bridge, Charles slowly exited the vehicle according to police instructions. When the agents approached to handcuff him, his look didn't show the characteristic arrogance, just an exhausted resignation. "Charles Anderson, you are under arrest for the crimes of embezzlement, corporate fraud, document forgery, and attempted homicide against Anthony Davis," announced the detective formally. "My lawyer will be waiting at the station," replied Charles, more out of habit than conviction. During the journey back to Seattle in the back seat of the police car, Charles maintained absolute silence, looking out the window at the landscapes he probably wouldn't see in freedom for the next few years. Occasionally, his thoughts returned to Helen's message about Clarissa. What would his daughter think of him now? How would he face the judgment in her eyes? The next day, the press massively followed Charles's arrival at the Central Seattle Police Station. Cameras, microphones, and reporters crowded, eager to capture images of the once respected businessman, now transformed into a symbol of greed and betrayal. "Mr. Anderson, did you plan the accident that left your partner paraplegic 5 years ago?" shouted a reporter. "Is it true that you tried to escape to Canada with millions in embezzled funds?" questioned another. Charles kept his gaze down, escorted by 2 police officers through the human corridor formed by journalists. His fall, as spectacular as his rise, was now public entertainment. In the interrogation room, he found Detective Stanley and his own lawyer, visibly uncomfortable with the situation. "Your client faces extremely serious charges," the detective began, opening a folder full of documents. "I strongly recommend maximum cooperation to consider possible mitigating factors." Charles looked at his lawyer, who nodded discreetly. "Before any formal statement," said Charles, "I'd like to make a request." "I'm listening," replied Stanley, cautious. "I want to speak with Anthony Davis." The detective smiled slightly. Curious, he made exactly the same request. A few hours later, an unusual configuration was arranged. In the detective's office, more spacious and less austere than the interrogation room, Charles waited, still handcuffed, but without escort inside the room. The door opened and Anthony entered, supported by crutches, accompanied by Julia. The meeting of the ex-partners, after the confrontation on the balcony that had almost cost Anthony's life, carried an almost palpable tension. For long moments, they just observed each other in silence, one measuring the transformation of the other, both processing the abyss that now separated them. "You look well," Charles finally said, breaking the oppressive silence, "for someone who fell from a 20th floor." Anthony allowed himself a slight smile. "And you look tired, for someone so accustomed to controlling everything." Detective Stanley and Julia remained at a distance, silent witnesses to that meeting loaded with shared history. "Why did you want to see me?" asked Charles, the handcuffs tinkling softly when he adjusted his position in the chair. "To confirm my defeat personally?" "No," replied Anthony, with surprising tranquility. "I wanted to see you to understand. 30 years of partnership, Charles. Our families grew up together. Our children played in the same pool during Sunday barbecues." He paused, seeking the right words. "At what point did everything change? At what point did I become dispensable, or worse, an obstacle to be eliminated?" The question hung between them, laden with decades of memories, promises, and finally, betrayals. "You really don't know?" Charles leaned forward, eyes fixed on his ex-partner. "It started well before your accident, when we refused the expansion to the northeast because you considered it risky, when we rejected that international partnership that could have made us global because you feared losing quality control. Your caution was suffocating our growth. Caution that built a solid company, respected for its ethics and quality," Anthony countered. "But that's not the real reason, is it?" Charles briefly looked away, an unusual gesture for someone generally so confrontational. "Maybe I got tired of always being second. You were the face of the company, the admired visionary, while I was the efficient assistant." "I never saw you that way," protested Anthony, genuinely surprised. "It doesn't matter how you saw me, it matters how everyone else saw me." Charles straightened up, recovering part of his habitual posture. "When you had the accident and I took full control, I could finally prove my worth. The company grew 300% in 5 years under my exclusive direction. At the cost of principles that defined us." Anthony shook his head, sadness evident in his expression. "Was it worth it, Charles? At what price did that growth come?" The question seemed to hit Charles with unexpected force. Behind the facade of arrogance, something momentarily faltered. "Clarissa called me this morning," he said, changing the subject. "You know what she asked me? Is it true, Dad? Did you really try to kill Uncle Anthony?" Charles swallowed hard, his voice trembling for the first time. How does one answer that? Anthony observed the man before him, no longer the powerful and intimidating businessman, but someone confronting the devastating consequences of his choices. "You have children, Anthony. You know what it's like to look in their eyes and see disappointment." Julia, who was observing silently, stepped forward. "I can answer that," she said with surprising firmness. "I spent 10 years believing that my father didn't want me around after the accident. 10 years based on messages falsified by you, Charles. So yes, I know exactly what that disappointment is like." Charles faced the young woman, the reality of his actions reflected in her determined eyes. "I didn't expect your forgiveness," he murmured. "It's not about forgiveness now," intervened Anthony. "It's about truth. I need to hear from you. Were you responsible for my accident 5 years ago?" A heavy silence filled the room. Detective Stanley leaned slightly, attentive to the response that could add another serious accusation to the already extensive case. Charles took a deep breath, seeming to age years in that moment. "Yes," he finally admitted. "I hired someone to tamper with the brakes. The intention was just to incapacitate you temporarily, create an opportunity for me to take control. I never imagined it would result in permanent damage." The confession, although expected after the evidence found, still hit Anthony hard. One thing was to suspect, another completely different was to hear the direct confirmation. "Thank you for the honesty, late as it may be," said Anthony after a moment of reflection. "That was all I needed to hear." He stood up with the help of his crutches, preparing to leave the room. Julia approached to help him. "Why aren't you more furious?" asked Charles, confused by the contained reaction. "Why all this civility?" Anthony turned one last time. "Because I understood something fundamental during my fall from that balcony. When you believe you're about to lose everything, you realize what truly matters. And revenge, Charles, isn't on the list. With those words, Anthony and Julia left the room, leaving Charles alone with the weight of his own actions. In the weeks that followed, the story of the businessman who miraculously survived thanks to a premonitory horse continued to fascinate the public. The legal case against Charles Anderson advanced rapidly, strengthened by his own confession and the mountain of evidence collected. Helen initiated divorce proceedings, dedicating herself to rebuilding her relationship with her daughter Clarissa, deeply shaken by the revelations about her father. Anthony, in turn, focused on his own recovery and the reconstruction of the company. With Julia's help, who decided to remain in the United States, he implemented a restructuring plan that prioritized the recovery of the fundamental values that had guided the first years of success. But the project that most passionate him arose directly from his extraordinary experience: the massive expansion of the New Dawn Rehabilitation Center, transforming it into the largest equine therapy center in the country. 6 months after the RPE incident, on a sunny spring morning, the new complex of the center was officially inaugurated. Reporters, authorities, and special guests gathered to witness the cutting of the inaugural ribbon. "This place represents much more than animal-assisted therapy," Anthony spoke, now using only a light cane for support. "It represents the deep and inexplicable connection we can develop with beings that don't speak our language, but understand our essence." Melissa, now technical director of the expanded center, led Apollo to the stage. The horse, serene and majestic, provoked emotional applause when approaching Anthony affectionately. "Science still can't fully explain how Apollo knew I was in danger that night," continued Anthony, caressing the animal's neck. "Perhaps some connections transcend our rational understanding. What we know for certain is that lives can be transformed through these special partnerships." Julia, beside her father, observed the audience with pride. Among the guests, patients from the center and their families listened attentively, many with tears in their eyes. "Our mission is to provide this transformative experience for people facing physical, emotional, or cognitive limitations," explained Anthony. "Each challenge overcome here represents a victory not just for those who face it, but for all of us who believe in human potential." After the ceremony, while talking with some guests, Anthony received a letter discreetly delivered by an employee of the prison system. The sender, Charles Anderson. Moving away for a moment, he carefully opened the envelope. The brief message contained only 2 lines. "You were right. Some falls teach us to value what really matters." Anthony put the letter in his pocket, a slight smile on his lips. As he looked up, he found Apollo watching him attentively from across the courtyard, as if understanding exactly what had just happened. "Some connections truly transcend our understanding," he murmured to himself, as he walked toward the animal that had transformed not only his life, but the lives of so many others who would now find hope in that center. The Seattle sky, previously heavy with clouds at the beginning of this story, now displayed a vibrant and welcoming blue, promise of new chapters, new beginnings, and above all, new connections capable of saving, inspiring, and transforming.